So a lot of people love the Orks. They're big and loud, silly, colourful, and if you're into a certain kind of goofy humour, then they're pretty funny. Well, not me, of course. I only watch Black and White Fraser in Latin. They're like the one faction rejoinder to all the chuds who demand that 40k be grimdark. Because don't you know about the Demon Calabra? Haven't you heard about the Demon Calabra? Just having orcs in a setting means there's always some chance for Looney Tunes-ass physical comedy and bad puns. I don't want to get away from this aspect of the orcs at all, but what I'm proposing here is kind of like The Infinite and the Divine, which is the greatest book ever written, but in reverse. So Infinite and Divine took a faction who were soulless skeletons and gave them real personalities. Now the orcs have personalities, tons of personality. And I don't want to diminish that, but I do want there to be a different dimension to them. And that dimension is the fact that they are fucking terrifying. So, background. Millions of years before the present day in the setting, the galaxy was mostly colonised by this ancient reptilian species called the Old Ones, or sometimes the Slan, although that's more of a Warhammer fantasy type word. They were long-lived, very psychic, so they had mastered warp travel and they created a much larger and more stable version of what the Eldar would call the Webway. Now presumably 3 or 4 of the Chaos Gods were kicking around at the time, but the Old Ones don't seem to have been bothered by them. So in some galactic backwater, the Necrontyr had begun building their own empire. So unlike the Old Ones, they had short, painful lives, 0 psychic abilities, and they had to build their tiny empire thousands of years at a time by sending out slow torch ships, like generation ships basically, and they sent them out to their nearest star systems. And they were also fractious, and they couldn't keep their empire from falling into secession and civil war for reasons that are probably familiar from the Tau episode. It's just impossible to keep an empire together over interplanetary distances, where like a single message can take decades to arrive. So the then and current ruler of the Necrontyr, Zarek the Silent King, hit on a plan. Go full Ozymandias. Give the Empire a powerful enemy they can unite around fighting. The Old Ones. So they fought, the Old Ones won. The end. The Necrontyr couldn't manoeuvre around the Old Ones' march through the Webway, and they didn't have the numbers for like a galactic-scale civil war. They were outnumbered 100 to 1. But that was only round 1, because the Necrontyr weren't the only ones who had beef with the Old Ones. Millions of years before, they had fought with the Katan, or Star Gods. Now they're not gods exactly, more like sentient clouds of energy that just sit around a star and feed off it. But they also kind of have their own personalities and kind of spheres of influence, like classical Greco-Roman gods. So the Void Dragon is the Katan of technology, the Nightbringer is the Katan of death. The Katan gave the Necrontyr the technology they needed to fight the Old Ones and win, but they also had a solution for the Necrontyr's most pressing problem, their frail, cancer-racked bodies. It was the Katan who put the Necrons in their necrodermis bodies, the Necrons we know today. That stripped away their souls and left only a few of them, like nobles like Zarek and Trazyn the Infinite and Orkan the Diviner. They were the only ones that had anything like memories or personalities. This is an Orc episode, I promise. We just have to get the Necron stuff out of the way first. Okay, so the newly unkillable Necrons attacked the Old Ones. Even though they're one of the most powerful factions in lore today, we only are seeing a tiny fraction of their total strength. Most Necrons are still sleeping, and when they wake up, they absolutely will be more powerful than any other faction, save perhaps the Tyranids and the one rattling with a sausage. Now this time, the Old Ones were on the back foot, so they started creating warrior races to fight for them. Amongst them were the Jakero, the Eldari, who we know, and the Croc. The Croc, who were now known as Orks. So something I think a lot of people who study 40k lore get wrong about Crocs and Orks. The creatures we know as Crocs are 12 feet tall, exceptionally strong, super intelligent. The closest any Orc has become to being a Croc in the last million years, went toe to toe with the physically strongest Primarch, and it was a tie. A lot of people say that the current Orks devolved from the Crocs, or that without the old ones they slowly just became smaller and stupider, which isn't kind of how evolution works. And I don't think that's how it worked in the lore either. Orks become stronger when they're around more Orks, and that's not just their leaders, although their leaders get like an extra effect. It literally happens to every Ork. The Orks that the Imperium fought in the War of the Beast, which I'll talk about in a second, and were led by the aforementioned Super Ork, they were all the size of like Ork knobs, the upper class of Ork society, the biggest and meanest. And that was the largest number of Orks that had ever been together in one place and with one purpose that humanity has ever encountered. But that was a drunken fight in a flat-roofed car park compared to the war in heaven. A war in which the entire galaxy is the front line, with quintillions of troops on either side. That's just going to supercharge the Ork war field, that's a thing, and basically make every Ork go Ultra Instinct all at once. Oh, and another theory I have, this probably won't get borne out in the lore at a time, that the Eldari, copyright, were also created as a warrior race, right? And they're technologically advanced, they're psychically gifted, so they would have had a part to play in the war in heaven, but it would take like 1,000 Eldar Guardians to equal one Croc, and there's already billions of Crocs. So my theory is that they weren't created to fight exactly, although they did fight. They were created to create the Eldar gods, like Vol and Sheogorath, or whatever he's called. And they were created to create them so those gods could fight the Katan, which they did. We know that, right? We know that the Eldari laughing god, Sheogorath, tricked the Katan called the Outsider into literally eating the other Katan, which broke them into shards, which the Necrons still use today, and it ultimately kind of won the war for them. Anyway, I'm digressing. So, after the old ones were wiped out, the Croc and Eldari and Drakera were left around. And then there's a 60 million year gap in history. So, with most of their number killed and no real war to fight, the next generation of Orks would be closer to what we know today. They actually would have, devolved over time. And all kinds of crazy shit could be happening in those millions of years, with, races we've never heard of rise and fall in, Pikmin and Snorks, or bees, Italians, all kinds of crazy stuff. And the only constants were the Eldar. And honestly, I've got no idea how they just maintained a one-interrupted civilization for 60 million years. And they haven't, evolved or made new technology. It's pretty weird. But it's very likely in that time the Orks rose and fell hundreds of times, probably reaching to a point where there were super Orks. And the various races had to get together and exterminate them, and they were wiped out, but they always came back, right? Because the Orks are a fungus. They're a fungal infection. Every microscopic spore that an Ork produces can produce an entire Orkoid ecosystem. What we think of as an Ork is the Ork boys, right? They're the ones we see on the tabletop. But there's more to them than that is still Orks. There's the grots and snotlings. There's the squigs, which they eat and ride around on. Even the fungus they brew for beer is part of this massive Orkoid superorganism. And once the fungal network becomes sophisticated enough to start producing full-size Orks, boys, which typically takes around 20 odd years, those Orks are going to be savage at first, Stone Age, basically animals. But in a short time, they're going to develop the same technology, the same culture as every other Ork society in the galaxy. Leave them alone long enough, and an isolated Ork tribe is going to get to the point where they're building spacecraft and going into the void looking for a fight. And they're maybe going to feel a draw towards the war field of a great leader like Gazkul. An Ork isn't a singular thing. It's a whole network, like the mycelial networks that bind together fungus. Every node in that network makes it stronger, to the point that they can literally affect reality, which is the war field I mentioned earlier. And in the lore and the stories, this is mostly used for fun. So orcs have dumb beliefs like red vehicles will go faster, or orcs with blue face paint will be luckier. And those beliefs become literally true because they believe it. Guns that are just a box of metal scraps will fire when an orc uses it, but they'll be useless if a human picked it up, unless an orc was looking at them at the time to believe the gun was real. They're able to travel through the warp because their ships are covered in spikes and charms, and they believe that keeps demons away, so it does. The full capabilities of the warfield isn't known, so maybe if enough orcs got together they could destroy one of the Chaos Gods, or they could bring the Empire back to life. We just don't know. So there have been 3 times in recorded history where we kind of almost got to find out. The first was Ullanor. In the 31st millennium, the Emperor himself, 100,000 Space Marines and 8 million Astra Militarum soldiers fought what was back then the largest Orc war, their get-togethers, their army, their wars, the largest one anyone's ever seen. There's pretty good evidence from the first War of the Beast book, which we'll get to in a second, that Ullanor was why the creation of Primarchs and their Space Marine sons was so rushed and therefore so flawed. The Emperor is a super genius, and he was working with other super geniuses like Erda and Amar Astarte. If he had just taken his time, there would be no Black Rage in Sanguinius. All his Corvus Corax wouldn't be literally have schizophrenia, like the actual medical condition schizophrenia. He could have smoothed out all the problems in his sons and in the Space Marines. He could have made every Space Marine Primarch level if he wanted. But he didn't, and that was because of Ullanor. He needed to get something on the field right then and then. It's like if you go to play and you don't pay to all your minis. It was like that. So the war on Ullanor and the war boss Urlak Urg was getting to the point where there was every chance they would start producing Crocs. And once that happened, even if they had 1,000 Primarchs, it wouldn't be able to stop them. Fortunately, Horus was able to just about defeat Urg, even though his entire Terminator bodyguard, except Ezekiel Abaddon, died in the process. That was the triumph at Ullanor that made Horus into War Master Horus, and it set the table for the heresy. So following the heresy, when the Imperium was just putting itself together after the death of the Emperor and then rebooted Gilliman, who was basically the best leader they could ever possibly have, and he went and died, there was another, even bigger war, which doesn't really seem fair. At this point, humanity thought the Orcs had been pretty much crushed on Ullanor. Then they start seeing other alien species fleeing something, and then they get some anomalous gravity readings. Then an entire fucking moon just shows up. There was an Orc war out there so huge that they were using planetoids to get around on. Multiple planet-sized attack moons, plus their usual ships. And these Orcs, as I mentioned, they were huge. And they wiped out the Imperial Fist chapter down to one guy. Of course, there were other chapters who were successors to the Imperial Fist out there, and they had to enact the Last Wall Protocol to reform the original Legion, which is an action that the Codex definitely does not endorse, because the last time there were Legion-sized groups of Marines cutting about the place, the Emperor went and died. But still, they got the band back together. These attack moons just teleported right to Earth itself. They can only be defeated by one thing: glorious proletarian revolution. The Imperial Senate launched this cockamamie plan to have millions of barely armed civilians charge the war moon in Terra's orbit, overwhelming them through the immortal science of Marxist-Leninism. And this absolutely would have worked right until the point that it didn't. You see, because true communism has never been tried, and if you actually understood dialectical materialism, Now this war was so bad that the Black Templars, the most devout chapter and first choice of problematic wargamers, made a truce with the Iron Warriors. It was so comprehensively over that Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines were willing to put aside their differences. It was so bad that Orks started talking, and not the usual "I threw a brick through the window of a Greg's 'cause save our children, love our queen, don't like it, there's a door." Not that kind of English, but BBC English. It was so utterly, perfectly Jova that the Orks will use a received pronunciation. They sent an ambassador to the High Lords of Terror, who were so dumbfounded that the ambassador decided that they just weren't worth speaking to. So the cruel winter of It's So Over became a glorious spring of We're Back by the arrival of Vulcan. Vulcan, who's going to get an episode because he's awesome, was the last Primarch really still active in the Imperium by that time, even though he'd been absent. He was found on the planet of Caldera, single-handedly wiping out thousands of Orks with a giant hammer called Doom Tremor. Play the Doom theme right now. Vulcan led a counterattack to, of all places, Ullanor, to fight the war boss, who was only known as the Bzzt. Also, Ullanor by that time had been fully militarized. It was covered in guns, traps, entire cities that were basically big Stalingrads. It was crazy. So Vulcan took on the Bzzt himself in this colossal temple that was also a giant mech that could walk. It was a temple to the Orc gods Gork and Mork. And it was in the capital city of, get this, Gorkogrod. Only then do things start to get silly. The Bzzt killed the chapter masters of the Crimson Fist and Ultramarines like they were nothing. It's a sentence in the book. And this guy was 10 meters tall and wearing mega armor. Vulcan took him on himself while the rest of the Imperial forces retreated. He plunged himself and the Bzzt into a reactor that ran on pure War energy. Yes. Vulcan absorbed the pure Orky energy and used that to power a strike to the warboss's head that shattered it like that bit in Midsummer and destroyed the reactor. And Vulcan probably died in that explosion. But you know who didn't die in that explosion? The Bzzt. He was fine. He teleported back to the attack moon that was still orbiting Earth, told all humans that he was going to eat them, and the survivors of the attack on Ullanor painted their armour black and, attacked the attack moon, trying to teleport it out of the solar system, but only ended up teleporting half. The rest of it fell onto Earth and killed hundreds of millions of people. That's the story of how the Death Watch started. Then there was another attack on Ullanor. This time they were going to use a Sister of Silence's anti-psychic field to disrupt the War energy and pop the Orcs' heads. I'll get to Sisters of Silence at some point. Basically, they cancel out psychic energy around them. But then the Bzzt showed up. Only it wasn't the Bzzt, it was a Prime Orc, who was almost as big as the Bzzt, but not the Bzzt. And then there were a bunch of Prime Orcs. Of course, the Bzzt wasn't just having a big fight, you see. He was making his copy of the Imperium, complete with its own Primarchs, each of which represented one of the 6 main Orc clans. Oh, and then the completely fine and alive Bzzt shows up. The Imperials managed to get off their psychic attack and pop a lot of Orcs' heads, but the Bzzt killed the last remaining Imperial Fist by straight up stepping on him, Mario style. Then, after months of Orc attacks that saw almost the entirety of the Imperial Navy wiped out, and some planets just straight up surrendering to the Orcs and being slaughtered, there was the third and final attack on Ullanor. The Imperial Fist successor chapters each gave up a portion of their manpower to reform the Imperial Fists, who took on the Vanguard in a final all-out attack alongside the Adeptus Mechanicus. Now the Toaster Humpers were pivotal here because they launched several meteorites at Ullanor, wiping out a portion of the trillions of Orcs on the world. Imperial forces fought their way to the Bzzt throne room for the 3rd time, and they wanted to use the Sister of Silence gimmick again. And it worked. They blew up the beast's head. The War dissolved, but then so did the Imperium. There was a bloody coup back on Terra called the Beheading. Marines were fighting assassins in the Imperial Palace, which would look so cool, and the entire government collapsed for 20 years. The Horus Heresy was worse in terms of pure body count, but that stretched over 9 years, and the War of the Beast lasted for 2. The next biggest war was the second and third wars for the planet of Armageddon, led by Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Fracka. Wait. Mag Uruk Fracka. Mag Uruk Fracka. Mag Uruk Fracka. Liz Truss. He's named after Liz Truss. So in the wake of the War of the Beast, the Mechanicus was tasked with destroying the planet of Ullanor. Kind of clearing up. It was obviously a big draw for the Orks. They didn't want it to happen again. And they didn't do this, because the Mechanicum are literally the most evil faction in the entire setting, and there'll be a show about that soon. Instead, they used an Ork teleporter, literal name, to send the planet into another system, where it was rediscovered and named Armageddon. Armageddon needs about 5 episodes to do it justice, but that's not because it's the biggest Ork war of all time. That honour still goes to the War of the Beast. Armageddon was a battle for one planet, whereas the War of the Beast waged across the entire galaxy. Now, the war for Armageddon isn't significant for its scale, but what it means for the Orks' future. If they can recapture Ullanor, which might be their homeworld, then something could happen to build up the kind of numbers that would allow them to start getting War of the Beast powerful again. Ghazghkull himself is the prophet of the war. He's got a direct line to Gorka Mork, and they're telling him he needs to take Armageddon. There are already enough galaxy-spanning threats in the setting right now, Tyranids for example, but I bet that one day we'll see the final war for Armageddon. And hopefully Ghazghkull's nemesis, Commissar Yarrick, is going to return, because Games Workshop did him dirty. And there's probably going to be something as big as the War of the Beast, or they'll just tease doing it forever. That seems to be the predictable way to make Orks scary again in the grand narrative. Make more of them, have them kill more people. But there are always reminders that these are brutal monsters in the fiction. During the War of the Beast, there's this scene where we got to see what Orks are capable of doing to humans. They were farming hundreds of people like cattle. They pulled their teeth and fingernails out so they couldn't harm each other, and they were fattening them up like factory hens. They were so brutalised their minds were completely gone. And there's a lot of and then 100 billion people died when the Cacoddominus head exploded, kind of grimdark in the setting. But the way the Orks could and probably still do treat humans, like the way we treat animals, it's just really nasty. It's a scene that stuck with me while I probably would have forgotten about the try-hard grimdark stuff like the demoncal blah blah. I would have forgotten about it if anti-woke dorks didn't keep bringing it up. And they ripped it off from Berserk, right? That's just fully, they pulled that out of an episode of Berserk. Go look that up. Berserk is great. So this is why the Orks are scary. They don't give a shit about humanity in a way that's very human. Demons or Drukhari might torture someone for 1,000 years, but their sadism is so baroque that it just becomes abstract after a while. Orks remind us that we could be victims of a very real violence. I could step out my front door and be cut to pieces by a muscle-bound freak who talks like this. I live near a football stadium. American 40k fans are always saying that Orks talk like soccer hooligans. And that's true. It's also true that throughout Europe, football firms are a major part of organised crime and the extreme right. Might makes right, whoever's biggest and hardest gets to make the rules. That's everywhere. Everything from Rwanda to Gaza to the riots in the UK this summer were humans becoming beasts. And doesn't it always feel like the worst people in the world keep getting what they want despite them being incredibly stupid? Right now, the Orks are the comic relief faction, but they're not always going to be, and that is scary.